This is part 5 of Eustace Mullins's The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, and we are in chapter 8, but before we proceed, we gotta do the disclaimer. This is for educational purposes only. It can be for, and is for criticism perhaps, comment for sure, news reporting not likely, teaching only if someone is willing to learn something from the text. Scholarship, not really. I'm not a scholar. And research for anybody who's interested, I suppose, in researching such things. But they would just get the book itself, I suppose. So, anyways, let's get into the text. Quote, "Money is the worst of all contraband," end quote. William Jennings Bryan. It is now apparent that there might have been no world war without the Federal Reserve System. Imagine that. A strange sequence of events, none of which were accidental, had occurred. Without Theodore Roosevelt's bull moose, quote-unquote, candidacy, the popular President Taft would have been re-elected, and Woodrow Wilson would have returned to obscurity. There's a footnote here. Note, page 34, House revealed to me in a confidential moment, quote, Wilson was elected by Teddy Roosevelt, end quote. Strange from the book The Strangest Friendship in History, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel House, George Sylvester Virek, or Virek, Liveright, New York, 1932. I suppose it's House talking to Virek, is what the quote is. Wilson elected. It revealed to me being Virek. Anyway, end of footnote. If Wilson had not been elected, we might have had no Federal Reserve Act, and World War I could have been avoided, or at least stalled. But who knows? It's a huge hypothetical. The European nations had been led to maintain large standing armies as the policy of the central banks, which dictated their governmental decisions. In April 1887, the Quarterly Journal of Economics had pointed out, quote, a detailed review, REVUE, of the public debts of Europe shows interest in sinking fund payments of 5,343 million annually, 5 1/3 billion. M. Neymark's Neymarck possessive. This person's conclusion is much like Mr. Atkinson's. The finances of Europe are so involved in that the governments may ask whether war, with all its terrible chances, is not preferable to the maintenance of such a precarious and costly peace. If the military preparations of Europe do not end in war, they may well end in the bankruptcy of the states, or if such follies lead neither to war nor to ruin, then they assuredly point to industrial and economic revolution. End quote. From 1887 to 1914, this precarious system of heavily armed but bankrupt European nations endured, while the United States continued to be a debtor nation, borrowing money from abroad but making few international loans. because we did not have a central bank or mobilization of credit, quote unquote. The system of national loans developed by the Rothschilds served to finance European struggles during the 19th century because they were spread out over Rothschild's branches in several countries. By 1900, it was obvious that the European countries could not afford a major war. They had large standing armies, universal military service, and modern weapons, but their economies could not support the enormous expenditures. The Federal Reserve System began operations in 1914, forcing the American people to lend the Allies $25 billion, which was not repaid, although considerable interest was paid to New York bankers. The American people were driven to make war on the German people, with whom we had no conceivable political or economic quarrel. There's no comma between conceivable and political. So I kind of made it sound like there was. Anyways, moreover, the United States comprised the largest nation in the world, composed of Germans. Almost half of its citizens were of German descent, and by a narrow margin, German had been voted down as the national language. Footnote: 1787 Constitutional Convention. End of footnote. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? We almost be sprechen Sie Deutsch. Or sprechen, I don't know. I don't know German. Anyways, the German ambassador to Turkey, Baron Wangeheim, Wangeheim, asked the American ambassador to Turkey, Henry Morgenthau, why the United States intended to make war with Germany. Quote, "We Americans," replied Morgenthau, speaking for the group of Harlem real estate operators of which he was the head, quote, "are going to war for a moral principle," end quote. Yeah, right. Your morality is immorality. J.P. Morgan received the proceeds of the first Liberty loan to pay off $400 million, which he advanced to Great Britain at the outset of the war. To cover this loan, $68 million in notes had been issued under the provisions of the Aldrich-Vreeland Act for issuing notes against securities, the only time this provision was employed. The notes were retired as soon as the Federal Reserve banks began operations, and replaced by the notes were replaced by Federal Reserve notes. During 1915 and 1916, Wilson kept faith with the bankers who had purchased the White House for him by continuing to make loans to the Allies. His Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, protested constantly, stating that, quote, "money is the worst of all contraband," end quote. By 1917, the Morgans and Kuhn Loeb Company had floated $1.5 billion in loans to the Allies. The bankers also financed a host of quote peace end quote operations which worked to get us involved in the World War. The Commission for the Relief in Belgium manufactured atrocity stories against the Germans, while a Carnegie organization, the League of Enforce Peace, agitated in Washington for our entry into the war. This later became the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which during the 1940s was headed by Alger Hiss. One writer, footnote, note Emmett Tyrrell Jr., Richmond Times-Dispatch, February 15, 1983, quote, "Every peace movement of this century has been followed by war," end quote. So, end of footnote. One writer claims that he had never seen any peace movement, quote unquote, which did not end in war. The U.S. ambassador to Britain, Walter Hines Page, complained that he could not afford the position and was given $25,000 a year spending money by $25,000 a year spending money by Cleveland H. Dodge, president of the National City Bank. H. L. Mencken openly accused Page in 1916 of being a British agent, which was unfair. Page was merely a banker's agent. On March 5, 1917, Page sent a confidential letter to Wilson, quote, "I think that the pressure of this approaching crisis has gone beyond the ability of the Morgan Financial Agency for the British and French governments. The greatest help we could give the Allies would be a credit. Unless we go to war with Germany, our government, of course, cannot make such a direct grant of credit." End quote. The Rothschilds were wary of Germany's ability to continue in the war, despite the financial chaos caused by their agents, the Warburgs, who were financing the Kaiser, and Paul Warburg's brother Max, who was head of the German Secret Service, authorized Lenin's train to pass through the lines and execute the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Hmm. Hmm. According to Undersecretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt, America's heavy industry had been preparing for war for a year. Both the Army and the Navy departments had been purchasing war supplies in large amounts since early in 1916. Cordell Hull, Hull, remarks in his memoirs, quote, "The conflict enforced the further development of the income tax principle, aiming as it did at the one great untaxed source of revenue. The income tax law had been enacted in the nick of time to meet the demands of war. And the conflict also assisted the putting into effect of the Federal Reserve System, likewise in the nick of time." End quote. One may ask, in the nick of time for what? Or for whom, rather. Certainly not for the American people, who had no need for mobilization of credit, quote unquote, for a European war, or to enact an income tax to finance a war. Hull's statement affords a rare glimpse into the machinations of our, quote, public servants, end quote. The notes of the Journal of Political Economy, October 1917, state, quote, "The effect of the war upon the business of the Federal Reserve banks has required an immense development of the staffs of these banks, with a corresponding increase in expenses. Without, of course, being able to anticipate so early and expensive a demand for their services in this connection, the framers of the Federal Reserve Act had provided that the Federal Reserve banks should act as fiscal agents of the government." End quote. The bankers had been waiting since 1887 for the United States to enact a central bank plan so that they could finance a European war among the nations whom they had already bankrupted with armament and defense quote-unquote programs. The most demanding function of the central bank mechanism is war finance. I believe this is what G. Edward Griffin would call the Mandrake mechanism. I should probably read that quote. We'll just take a little detour here, because I'm pretty sure Griffin took a leaf out of Mullins's book. This is G. Edward Griffin. On page 215, he writes in his book, "The Creature from Jekyll Island." So he's writing about the Federal Reserve in this book also. So on page 215 of which edition is this? I don't know if the page. This is the 5th edition that came out in 2010, I believe. 5th edition was 2010. He writes on page 215, quote, "The new alchemy." So it's a little. This is the title of section 3. The new alchemy. The ancient alchemists sought in vain to convert lead into gold. Modern alchemists have succeeded in that quest. The lead bullets of war have yielded an endless source of gold for those magicians who control the Mandrake mechanism. The startling fact emerges that, without the ability to create fiat money, most modern wars simply would not have occurred. As long as the mechanism is allowed to function, future wars are inevitable. This is the story of how they come to pass. And he goes into all that. I do want to read that book at some point, but definitely not for the next one. Back to back, I don't know if I want to do Mullins and Griffin back to back. That'd be too much overlap, I think. But maybe down the road I'll read it for the channel. All right, back to Mullins's The Secrets of the Federal Reserve. Where am I? Right, because the Rothschilds and the bankers have been waiting since 1887 for the United States to enact a central bank plan so that they could finance a European war among the nations whom they had already bankrupted with armament and defense quote-unquote programs. So that's how they turned lead into gold, right? The most demanding function of the federal bank, of the central bank mechanism, is war finance. Right, exactly. This is how they do it. On October 13th, 1917, Woodrow Wilson made a major address stating, quote, "It is manifestly imperative that there should be a complete mobilization of the banking reserves of the United States. The burden and the privilege of the Allied loans must be shared by every banking institution in the country. I believe that cooperation on the part of the banks is a patriotic duty at this time, and that membership of the Federal Reserve System is a distinct and significant evidence of patriotism." End quote. Yeah, what a sack of horseshit that is. You're a fucking puppet, dude. President Wilson, sir, you are a puppet. You were put in that office by such bankers. I mean, not all of the bankers of the United States, but certainly the big five, as Mullins puts it. J.P. Morgan being at the top at that time. Anyways, E.W. Kemmerer, 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 writes that, quote, as fiscal agents of the government, the Federal Reserve Banks rendered the nation services of incalculable value after our entrance into the war. They aided greatly in the conversation of our gold resources. Did I say conversation? I mean conservation. There I go with. Hopefully, that's my only dyslexic episode of the night. They aided greatly in the conservation of our gold resources, in the regulation of our foreign exchanges, and in the centralization of our financial energies. One shudders when he thinks that one shudders when he thinks what might have happened if the war had found us with our former decentralized and antiquated banking system. End quote. Mr. Kemmerer's shudders ignore the fact uh, that if we had kept quote our antiquated banking system end quote, we would not have been made to finance the World War or to enter as a participant ourselves. Woodrow Wilson himself did not believe in his crusade to save the world for democracy. He later wrote that, quote, the World War was a matter of economic rivalry, end quote. On being questioned by Senator McCumber, MC, capital C, UMBER, McCumber, or Macumber, about the circumstances of our entry into the war, Wilson was asked, quote, do you think if Germany had committed no act of war or no act of injustice against our citizens that we would have gotten into this war? End quote. Quote, I do think so. End quote, Wilson replied, quote, you think we would have gotten in anyway? End quote, pursued McCumber. I do, quote unquote, said Wilson. In Wilson's war message in 1917, he concluded an incredible tribute to the communists in Russia who were busily slaughtering the middle class in that unfortunate country, and many Christians too. Quote, assurance has been added to our hope for the future peace of the world by the wonderful and heartening things that have been happening in the last few weeks in Russia. Here is a fit partner for a League of Honor. End quote. What is he smoking? The wonderful and heartening things that have been happening in the last few weeks in Russia? Wow, that is so fucked. If I'm understanding this correctly. Wilson's Paean, Paean. Is that a typo? I gotta look this up real quick. I don't think I've ever seen that word before. Paean or Pean. I guess it's pronounced Peen. Pean. A song of joyful praise or exultation, a fervent expression of joy or praise, an ancient Greek hymn of thanksgiving or invocation, especially to Apollo. Because saying a word so close to genitalia is not something I certainly want to really read. I'm just going to pronounce it Paean. Wilson's Paean so a joyful song, joyful praise or exultation to a bloodthirsty regime, which has since murdered 66 million of its inhabitants in the most barbarous manner exposes his true sympathies and his true backers, the bankers who had financed the blood purge in Russia. When the communist revolution seemed in doubt, Wilson sent his personal emissary, Elihu Root, Leihu Root, Root, Elihu Root. Sometimes there's a giant moth that hits the window and then makes a noise, so it distracts me sometimes. Where was I? Elihu Root to Russia in one with $100 million from his special emergency war fund to save the toppling Bolshevik regime. That's wild. The documentation of Kuhn-Loeb Company's involvement in the establishment of communism in Russia is much too extensive to be quoted here, but we include one brief mention typical of the literature on the subject in his book Tsarism and the Revolution. I'm going to butcher this name. General Arsene de Gulevich, Goulevitch, Arsene, Arsene. So Arsene de Gulevich, I believe that's probably as best as I'm going to get. He writes, quote, Mr. Bakhmetiev, Bakmetiev, the late Russian imperial ambassador to the United States, tells us that the Bolsheviks, after victory, transferred 60 million rubles in gold between the years 1918 and 1922 to Kuhn-Loeb Company. Well, well, well. What do we have here? End quote. After our entry into World War I, Woodrow Wilson turned the government of the United States over to a triumvirate of his campaign backers, Paul Warburg, Bernard Baruch, and Eugene Meyer. Baruch was appointed head of the War Industries Board with life and death powers over every factory in the United States. Eugene Meyer was appointed head of the War Finance Corporation, in charge of the loan program which financed the war. Paul Warburg was in control of the nation's banking system. Footnote. New York Times, August 10th, 1918, quote, Mr. Paul Warburg was the author of the plan organizing the War Finance Corporation, end quote. Well, isn't that just dandy? That's the end of the footnote. Knowing that the overwhelming sentiment of the American people during 1915 and 1916 had been anti-British and pro-German, excuse me, hiccups or something. The overwhelming sentiment of the American people during 1915 and 1916 had been anti-British and pro-German. Our British allies viewed with some trepidation the prominence of Paul Warburg and Kuhn-Loeb Company in the prosecution of the war. They were uneasy about his high position in the administration because of his brother Max Warburg was at the time serving as the head of the German Secret Service. On December 12, 1918, the United States Naval Secret Service report on Mr. Warburg was as follows, quote, Warburg, Paul, New York City, German, naturalized citizen, 1911, was decorated by the Kaiser in 1912, was vice chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, handled large sums furnished by Germany for Lenin and Trotsky, has a brother who is leader of the espionage system of Germany, end quote. Strangely enough, this report, which must have been compiled much earlier, while we were at war with Germany, is not dated until December 12, 1918. After the armistice had been signed. Also, it does not contain the information that Paul Warburg resigned from the Federal Reserve Board in May 1918, which indicates that it was compiled before. And that's headset Concanal number 1. Where was I? Um, Warburg resigned from the Federal Reserve Board in May 1918, which indicates that it was compiled before May 1918, when Paul Warburg would theoretically have been open to a charge of treason because of his brother's control of Germany's Secret Service. Paul Warburg's brother Felix in New York was a director of the Prussian Life Insurance Company of Berlin, and presumably would not have liked to see too many of his policyholders killed in the war. On September 26, 1920, the New York Times mentioned in its obituary of Jacob Schiff, in reference to Kuhn-Loeb and Company, quote, during the World War, certain of its members were in constant contact with with the government in an advisory capacity. It shared in the conferences which were held regarding the organization and formation of the Federal Reserve System. Pause, because I have to cough. That's end quote. The 1920 Schiff obituary revealed for the first time that Jacob Schiff, like the Warburgs, also had two brothers in Germany during World War I, Philip and Ludwig Schiff of Frankfurt on Main, who also were active as bankers to the German government. Well, well, well. This was not a circumstance to be taken lightly, as on neither side of the Atlantic were the said bankers obscure individuals who had no influence in the conduct of the war. On the contrary, the Kuhn-Loeb partners held the highest governmental posts in the United States during World War I, while in Germany, Max and Fritz Warburg. You said Philip and Ludwig, but where'd Fritz come from? That's another relative, another brother or something. Fritz and Warburg and Paul and Ludwig Warburg, not Schiff. I'm already getting confused. They all seem the same to me. Fritz and Ludwig Schiff, not Warburg, but Fritz Warburg, along with these two brothers of Jacob Schiff, moved in the highest councils of government. From memoirs of Max Warburg, quotes, the Kaiser thumped the table violently and shouted, quote, must you always be right? End quote, but then listened carefully to Max's view on financial matters, end quote. In June 1918, Paul Warburg wrote a private note to Woodrow Wilson, quote, I have two brothers in Germany who are bankers. They naturally now serve their country to their utmost ability as I serve mine, end quote. Yeah, right. Neither Wilson nor Warburg viewed the situation as one of concern, and Paul Warburg served out his term on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors while World War I continued to rage. The background of Kuhn-Loeb Company that had been exposed in, quote, Truth magazine, end quote, edited by George Conroy. Quote, Mr. Schiff is head of the great private banking house of Kuhn-Loeb and Company, which represents the Rothschilds' interest on this side of the Atlantic. He has been described as a financial strategist and has been for years the financial minister of the great impersonal power known as Standard Oil. He was hand in glove with the Harrimans, the Goulds, Goulds, and the Rockefellers in all their railroad enterprises and has become the dominant power in the railroad and financial world in America. Louis Brandeis, Brandeis, because of his great ability as a lawyer and for other reasons, which will appear later, was selected by Schiff as the instrument through which Schiff hoped to achieve his ambition in New England. His job was to carry on an agitation which would undermine public confidence in the New Haven system and cause a decrease in the price of its securities, thus forcing them on the market for the wreckers to buy. End quote. Sheesh. We mentioned Schiff's lawyer Brandeis. Man, I'm really flunking on the names tonight. Brandeis here because we mentioned him here because the first available appointment on the Supreme Court of the United States, which Woodrow Wilson was allowed to fill, was given to the Kuhn Loeb lawyer Brandeis. Not only was the U.S. Food Administration managed by Hoover's director Louis Lichtenstein Strauss, who married into Kuhn Loeb Company by marrying Alice Hanauer, Hanauer, daughter of partner Jerome Hanauer, but in the most critical field, military intelligence, Sir William Wiseman, chief of the British Secret Service, was a partner of Kuhn Loeb and Company. Jeez. He worked most closely with Wilson's alter ego, Colonel House. Quote, between House and Wiseman, 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 there were soon to be few political secrets, and from their mutual comprehension resulted in large measure of our close cooperation with the British. End quote. One example of House's cooperation with Weizmann was a confidential agreement which House negotiated pledging the United States to enter into World War I on the side of the Allies. 10 months before the election which returned Wilson to the White House in 1916, quote, because he kept us out of the war, end quote, Colonel House negotiated a secret agreement with England and France on behalf of Wilson, which pledged the United States to intervene on behalf of the Allies. On March 9, 1916, Wilson formally sanctioned the undertaking. Nothing could more forcefully illustrate the duplicity of Woodrow Wilson's nature than his nationwide campaign on the slogan, quote, he kept us out of war, end quote. Nothing has changed. The same old kind of bullshit tactics that have been. Why are these still effective 100 years later? Why? He kept us out of the war. Good fucking night. When he had pledged 10 months earlier to involve us in the war on the side of England and France. So while that was the campaign slogan, secretly he pledged to get into the war 10 months prior. It's like, this is how politicians work. I don't know why people buy into this shit anymore. Really. But like, what was it? P.T. Barnum said, "There's a sucker born every minute." Anyways, this explains why he was regarded with such contempt by those who learned the facts of his career. Yeah, no shit. H. L. Mencken wrote that Wilson was, quote, the perfect model of the Christian cad, C-A-D, end quote, and that we ought to, quote, dig up his bones and make dice of them, end quote. Oof. According to the New York Times, Paul Warburg's letter of resignation stated that some objection had been made because he had a brother in the Swiss Secret Service. The New York Times has never corrected this blatant falsehood, perhaps because Kuhn Loeb Company owned a controlling interest in its stock. Max Warburg was not Swiss. Yeah, no shit. He's German. And although he had probably come in contact with the Swiss Secret Service during his term of office as head of the German Secret Service, no responsible editor at the New York Times could have been unaware of the fact that Max Warburg was German and that his family banking house was in Hamburg, and that he held a number of high positions in the German government. He represented Germany at the Versailles Peace Conference. Well, and remained peacefully in Germany until 1939, during a period when persons of his religion were being persecuted. To avoid injury during the approaching war, when BOMBs would rain on Germany, Max Warburg was allowed to sail to New York, his funds intact. Well, isn't that just dandy? At the outset of World War I, Kuhn Loeb Company had figured in the transfer of German shipping interests to other control. Mr. Sir Cecil Spring-Rice, Sir Cecil Spring Rice, British ambassador to the United States, in a letter to Lord Grey, wrote, quote, Lord Grey, quote, another matter is the question of the transfer of the flag to the Hamburg America with a K ships. The company is practically a German government affair. The ships are used for government purposes. The Emperor himself is a large shareholder, and so is the great banking house of Kuhn Loeb Company. A member of that house, Warburg, has been appointed to a very responsible position in New York, although only just naturalized. He is connected in business with the Secretary of the Treasury, who is the President's son-in-law. It is he who is negotiating on behalf of the Hamburg America Shipping Company, end quote. Again, America spelled with a K in this quote. On November 13th, 1914, in a letter to Sir Valentine Chirol, Chirol, Spring Rice wrote, quote, page 241, verse 2, V period 2. Sure, the V stands for not chapter and verse, but whatever. Quote, I was told today that the New York Times has been practically acquired by Kuhn Loeb and Schiff, special protege of the German Emperor. Warburg, nearly related to Kuhn Loeb and Schiff, is a brother of the well-known Warburg of Hamburg, the associate of Ballin, Ballin, Hamburg America Line, is a member of the Federal Reserve Board, or rather the member. He practically controls the financial policy of the administration, and Paish and Blackett, Paish, Blackett, England, had mainly to negotiate with him. Of course, it was actually like negotiating with Germany. Everything that was said was German property. End quote. Colonel Garrison wrote in Roosevelt, Wilson, and the Federal Reserve Law that through the banking house of the Kuhn Loeb Company, a powerful weapon have been placed in the hands of the German Kaiser over the destiny of American business and American citizens. End quote. Garrison was referring to the Hamburg America affair. It seemed strange that Woodrow Wilson felt it necessary to place the nation in the hands of three men whose personal history was one of ruthless speculation and the quest for personal gain, or that during war with Germany, he found as persons of supreme trust a German immigrant naturalized in 1911, the son of an immigrant from Poland, and the son of an immigrant from France. Bernard Baruch first attracted attention on Wall Street in 1890 while working for A. Hausman and Company. In 1896, he merged the six principal tobacco companies of the United States into the Consolidated Tobacco Company, forcing James Duke and American Tobacco Trust to enter into this combination. The second great trust set up by Baruch brought the copper industry into the hands of the Guggenheim family, who controlled it ever since. Baruch worked with Edward H. Harriman, who was Schiff's frontman in controlling America's railway system for the Rothschild family. Baruch and Harriman also combined their talents to gain control over the New York City transit system, which has been in perilous financial condition ever since. In 1901, Baruch formed the firm of Baruch Brothers, bankers with his brother bankers with his brother Herman in New York. In 1917, when Baruch was appointed chairman of the War Industries Board, the name was changed to Hentz Brothers, Hentz. Testifying before the Nye Committee on September 13th, 1937, Bernard Baruch stated that, quote, all wars are economic in their origin, end quote. All wars are economic in their origin, quote unquote. So much for religious and political disagreements, which had been so much for religious and political disagreements, which had been specially touted as the causes for war. And there's a footnote here. Baruch also stated in his testimony, quote, I carried through the war three major investments: Alaska Juneo, Juneau Gold Mining Company with partner Eugene Mayer, Texas Gulf Sulfur, and Atolia Mining Company Tungsten, end quote. Representative Mason, Illinois, told the House on February 21st, 1921, that Baruch made more than $50 million in copper during the war. End of footnote. A profile in the New Yorker, quote unquote, magazine reported that Baruch made a profit of $750,000 in one day during World War I, after a phony peace rumor was planted in Washington. In Who's Who, quote unquote, Baruch mentions that he was a member of the commission which handled all purchasing for the Allies during the war. during World War I. In fact, Baruch was the commission. He spent the American taxpayers' money at the rate of $10 billion a year, and was also the dominant member of the munitions price fixing committee. He set the prices at which the government bought war materials. It would be naive to presume that the orders did not go to firms in which he and his associates had more than a polite interest. Yeah, no shit. Sheesh. There's like a typo or something here. It's almost like there's part of a sentence missing because now the sentence ends, where his associates had more than a polite interest, period, and then it spaces down to the next line, and there's no capital letter. It just says dictator over American manufacturers. So it's like sentence fragment, and there's a footnote. Baruch chose as assistant chairman of the War Industries Board a fellow Wall Street speculator Clarence Dillon Lapowitz, in parentheses, see biographies, end of footnote. At the Nye Committee hearings in 1935, Baruch testified, quote, President Wilson gave me a letter authorizing me to take over any industry or plant. There was Judge Gary, President of the United States Steel, whom we were having trouble with, and when I showed him that letter, he said, quote, I guess we'll have to fix this up, end quote, and he did fix it up, end quote. Some members of Congress were curious about Baruch's qualifications to exercise life and death powers over American industry in time of war. He was not a manufacturer and had never been in a factory. When he was called before a congressional committee, Bernard Baruch stated that his profession was speculator, quote unquote. A Wall Street gambler had been made czar of American industry. And now there's a next page has a facsimile of an article that appeared in the New York Times dated September 23rd, 1914. Listed are major stockholders of the 5 New York City banks, which purchased 40% of the 203,053 shares of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York when the system was organized in 1914. They thus obtained control of that Federal Reserve Bank and have held it ever since. As of Tuesday, July 26, 1983, the top 5 surviving New York City banks have increased their ownership of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to 53% of the shares. This article and shows a bunch of numbers in one column. Says the title banks stock list full of surprises. Many names associated by public with big stock holdings not found. Hetty Green's 30 shares. Frank Vanderlip missing from among large interests in National City. There's a little paragraph here. Publication yesterday of lists of stock holders in some of New York City's largest banks aroused considerable interest in the financial district, as much because of the absences of expected names as of the amounts of the principal holdings. The date at which the lists were compiled was not made known, and important changes may have taken place since, although as a rule there is little activity in bank shares, and the controlling interests in most institutions have been in the same hands for many years. Among the surprises in the lists, as published by Dow Jones and Company, was the discovery that Hetty Green, often spoken of as a very important factor in the conduct of the Chemical National, owns only 31 of the 30,000 shares of that institution. Frank Vanderlip, president of National City Bank, is not is not down among the principal shareholders, while James Stillman, chairman of the board of directors, holds 47,498 shares of the total 250,000. Mr. Stillman is also a large holder in the Hanover and the Citizens' Central. J.P. Morgan and Company have the biggest holdings of any firm. The shareholders' capitalization number, the shareholders, capitalization, number of shares, dividends, and the book value follow. And it lists a bunch of numbers and names and whatnot. There's Rockefellers and other people, Warburg, Baker, Equitable Life, Mutual Life, National Bank of Commerce, etc. All the same Chase National, Hanover National. Yeah, all the big ones. Anyways, on to the next page. We have chart 1. I don't know how this is going to work. I don't think it's going to work very well, but I'm going to try to put this up. The chart 1 is the next page, so it's a whole bunch of interlocking mechanisms with all these banks. You have NM Rothschild London at the top left, and then Bank of England at the top right, that top line. And then you have different companies underneath that have been expressly talked about throughout the book. J.P. Morgan, Brown Shipley, Lazard Brothers, J. Henry Schroeder. All these people are connected. I don't know if you can try to pause the video and see if you can read all that, but and the next 2 pages after cover the chart. So we'll just leave it up while he explains it, I suppose. It says here on page 94, chart 1. Chart 1 reveals the linear connection between the Rothschilds and the Bank of England and the London banking houses, which ultimately control the Federal Reserve banks through their stock holdings of bank stock and their subsidiary firms in New York. The 2 principal Rothschild representatives in New York, J.P. Morgan Company and Kuhn Loeb Company, were the firms which set up the Jekyll Island Conference, at which the Federal Reserve Act was drafted, who directed the subsequent successful campaign to have the plan enacted into law by Congress, and who purchased the controlling amounts of stock in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in 1914. These firms had their principal officers appointed to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the Federal Advisory Council in 1914. In 1914, a few families, blood or business related, owning, controlling stock of the existing banks, such as in New York City, caused those banks to purchase controlling shares in the Federal Reserve regional banks. Examination of the charts and text of the House Banking Committee staff report of August 1976 and the current stockholders list of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks shows this same family control. Bro. And then there's a giant line through the middle of the page. It's Baruch's erstwhile partner, Eugene Mayer, Alaska Juneau Gold Mining Company, later claimed that Baruch was a nitwit and that Mayer, with his family banking connection, Lazar Freres, had guided Baruch's investment career. These claims appeared in the 15th anniversary edition of the Washington Post editorial page, June 4th, 1983, with a parting shot from Mayer's editor, Al Friendly. What a name, Al Friendly. That, quote, every journalist in Washington, Mayer included, knew that Bernard M. Baruch was a self-aggrandizing phony, end quote. The third member of the triumvirate, Eugene Mayer, was son of the partner in the international banking house of Lazard Freres of Paris and New York. Of my own story, in my own story, name of the title of the book. Baruch explains how Mayer became head of the War Finance Corporation, quote, at the outset of World War I. He says, quote, I sought out Eugene Mayer Jr., who was a man of the highest integrity with a keen desire to be of public service, end quote. Yeah, right. Keen desire for public service, my ass. And my headset turns off again. Moving on. The nation has suffered greatly from persons who desired to be of public service, because bringo, because their desires often went considerably beyond their passion for office. In fact, Mayer and Baruch had operated an Alaska venture, Alaska Juneau Gold Mining Company, in 1915, and had worked together on other financial schemes. Mayer's family was a house of Lazar Freres, specialized in international gold movements. Eugene Mayer's stewardship of the War Finance Corporation comprises of one of the most amazing financial operations ever, partially recorded in this country. We say, quote, partially recorded, end quote, because subsequent congressional investigations revealed that each night the books were being altered before being brought in for the next day's investigation. Louis McFadden, chairman of the House Banking and Currency Committee, figured in two investigations of Mayer in 1925 and again in 1930, when Mayer was proposed as governor of the Federal Reserve Board. The Select Committee to investigate the destruction of government bonds submitted on March 2nd, 1925, quote, the preparation and destruction of government bonds, 68th Congress, second session, report number 1635, is the title of the thing. Quote, page 2, quote, duplicate bonds amounting to 2,314 pairs and duplicate coupons amounting to 4,698 pairs, ranging in the denominations from $50 to $10,000, have been redeemed to July 1st, 1924. Some of these duplications have resulted from error and some from fraud. End quote. These investigations may explain why, at the end of World War I, Eugene Mayer was able to buy control of Allied Chemical and Dye Corporation (DYE), and later on the nation's most influential newspaper, the Washington Post. The duplication of bonds, quote, one for the government, one for me, end quote, in denominations to the amount of 10,000 each resulted in a tidy sum. Yeah, I'd say. Page 6 of the hearings, quote, these transactions of the Treasury prior to June 20th, 1920, including for including settlements for purchases and sales executed by the War Finance Corporation, Eugene Mayer, managing director, were largely directed by the managing director of the War Finance Corporation, and settlements with the Treasury were made principally by him with the Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, and the books show that that the basis of the price paid by the government was over 1,894 millions worth of bonds, which is 1.8 billion, basically 1.9 billion dollars, which the Treasury purchased through the War Finance Corporation, was not the market price, and was not the cost of the bond plus interest. The elements entering into the settlement are not disclosed by the correspondence. The managing director of the War Finance Corporation stated that he and an assistant secretary of the Treasury, Jerome J. Hanauer, partner of Kuhn-Loeb Company, whose daughter married Louis L. Strauss, agreed to the price, and it was simply an arbitrary figure set by an assistant secretary of the Treasury as to the bonds so purchased by the War Finance Corporation. During the period of these transactions and up until quite a recent date, the managing director of the War Finance Corporation, Eugene Mayer Jr., in his private capacity, maintained an office at number 14 Wall Street, New York City, and through the War Finance Corporation sold about 70 millions in bonds to the government, and also bought through the War Finance Corporation about 10 millions in bonds, which and approved the bills for most, if not all, of the bonds in his official capacity as managing director of the War Finance Corporation. When these transactions just referred to uh, when these transactions just referred to were disclosed to the committee in open hearing, the managing director appeared before the committee and stated the fact that commissions were paid on these transactions. They were in turn paid over to the brokers selected by the managing director, who executed the orders issued by his brokerage house. And immediately after this disclosure to the committee, the managing director employed Ernst and Ernst, certified public accountants, to audit the books of the War Finance Corporation, who did, upon completion of the examination of these books, report to the committee that all monies received by the brokerage house of the managing director had been accounted for, while simultaneously with the examination being made by the committee. The certified public accountants heretofore referred to were nightly carrying on their examination. It was discovered by your committee that alterations and changes were being made in the books of record recovering these transactions, and when the same was called to the attention of the treasurer of the War Finance Corporation, he admitted that to the committee that changes were being made. To what extent these books have been altered during the process, the committee During the process, the committee have not been able to determine. After June 1921, about 10 billions worth of securities were destroyed. End quote. Before I go on, it looks like he's got like a large kind of footnote section for each chart, and then the rest of the page is just him going on with the book. So we're going to go to chart 2 because it's on this next page, on page 96. And here's the subsection explaining chart 2. This chart shows the interlocking banking directorates which were revealed by the backgrounds of the officials selected by the original members of the Federal Advisory Council in 1914. The principals were the same bankers who had been present or represented at the Jekyll Island Conference in 1910, and during the campaign to have the Federal Reserve Act enacted into law by Congress in 1913. These officials represented the largest stock holdings in the New York banks, which bought the controlling stock of in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and also were the principal correspondent banks of the banks in the other Federal Reserve districts, who in turn selected their officials to represent them on the Federal Advisory Council. So that's this chart. Um, the top left box says principal correspondent, First National Bank, New York, Philadelphia National Bank, and Bank of Manhattan, New York, is that top left one, if you can't read it. The middle left one states correspondent bank for many other outlying large banks, especially those owning a significant percentage of the FRB of their district, Federal Reserve Bank of their district, such as First National Bank of Chicago, Philadelphia National Bank, First National Bank of San Francisco. And bottom left box states 500 shares of First National Bank of Minneapolis held by First Securities New York, Baker/Morgan, in parentheses, 5,400 shares of 5,400 shares, National Bank of Commerce, Chase National Bank. And it just says like this owns this many shares, this and that, and all that happy horse shit. Anyway, back to the main text. It was Eugene Mayer's Washington Post, under the direction of his daughter Catherine Graham, which was later to drive a president of the United States from the White House on the grounds that he had knowledge of a burglary. What are we to think of the revelations of duplications of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of bonds during Mayer's directorship? Not dictatorship, but it might as well be, right? The directorship of the War Finance Corporation, the alteration of the books during a congressional investigation, and the fact that Mayer came out of this situation with many millions of dollars, with which he proceeded to buy Allied Chemical Corporation, the Washington Post, and other properties. Incidentally, Lazard Brothers, Mayer's family banking house, personally manages the fortunes of many of our political luminaries, including the Kennedy family fortune. Rubro. I pause here because I need to get something to drink. Anyways, I guess we'll move on to chart 3 on page 98. So it's 94, page 94. Wait, page 92 and 93 with the big, for the first big chart, and then page 96 for the second chart. Now page 98 for the chart 3. And it has J. Henry Schroeder at the top there. Chart 3, the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Company chart encompasses the entire history of the 20th century, embracing as it does the program parenthesis Belgian Relief Commission and parenthesis, which provisioned Germany from 1915 to 1918 and dissuaded Germany from seeking peace in 1916, financing you-know-who in 1933, so as to make a Second World War possible, backing the presidential campaign of Herbert Hoover, and even at the present time having two of its major executives of its subsidiary firm, Bechtel Corporation, serving as Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State in the Reagan administration. The head of the Bank of England since 1973, Sir Gordon Richardson, governor of the Bank of England, controlled by the House of Rothschild, was chairman of J. Henry Schroeder, Wagg and Company, WAGG, Wagg or Wagg and Company of London from 1963 to 1972, and director of J. Henry Schroeder, New York, and Schroeder Banking Corporation, New York, as well as Lloyd's Bank of London and Rolls-Royce. He maintains a residence on Sutton Place in New York City, and as head of, quote, the London Connection, end quote, can be said to be the single most influential banker in the world. Sheesh. All right, that's charts subsection. Back to the text. Take a little more water here. Besides these men, Warburg, Baruch, and Mayer, a host of J.P. Morgan Company and Kuhn Loeb Company partners, employees, and satellites came to Washington after 1917 to administer the fate of the American people. The Liberty Loans, which sold bonds to our citizens, were nominally in the jurisdiction of the United States Treasury under the leadership of Wilson's Secretary of Treasury, William G. McAdoo. Okay, McAdoo is back again with his name. Whom Kuhn Loeb Company had placed in charge of the Hudson-Manhattan Railway Company in 1902. Paul Warburg had most of the Kuhn Loeb Company firm with him in Washington during the war. Jerome Hanauer, partner in Kuhn Loeb Company, was Assistant Secretary of the Treasury, in charge of Liberty Loans. The two under-secretaries of the Treasury during the war were S. Parker Gilbert and Roscoe C. Leffingwell. That is Roscoe. The last name is Leffingwell. Leffingwell. Both Gilbert and Leffingwell came to the Treasury from the law firm of Cravath and Henderson, or Cravath, Cravath. So Cravath and Henderson, and returned to that firm when they had fulfilled their mission for Kuhn Loeb Company in the Treasury. Graveth and Henderson were the lawyers for Kuhn Loeb Company. Gilbert and Leffingwell subsequently received partnerships in J.P. Morgan and Company. So now we move on to the fourth chart. Chart number 4. It says Peabody-Morgan at the top there. And then this is a tinier subsection here. Chart 4. The Peabody-Morgan chart shows the London connection of these prominent banking firms, which have been headquartered in London since their inception. The Peabody Fortune set up an educational fund in 1865, which was later absorbed by John D. Rockefeller into the General Education Board in 1905, which in turn was absorbed by the Rockefeller Foundation in 1960. That's the end of chart 4 subsection. We get back to the text. It's going to be going on like this for the rest of the chapter. It looks like we got all these charts and he just keeps talking. Kuhn Loeb Company, the nation's largest owners of railroad properties in the country and in Mexico, protected their interests during the First World War by having Woodrow Wilson set up a United States Railroad Administration. The Director General was William McAdoo, and the Assistant Director General was John Skelton Williams, Comptroller of the Currency. Warburg replaced this setup in 1918 with a tighter organization, which he called the Federal Transportation Council. The purpose of both of these organizations was to prevent strikes against Kuhn Loeb Company during the war, in case the railroad workers should try to get in wages some of the millions of dollars in wartime profits which Kuhn Loeb received from the United States government. Among the important bankers present in Washington during the war was Herbert Lehman, Lehman, of the rapidly rising firm of Lehman Brothers, Bankers, New York, Lehman was promptly put on the general staff of the army and given the rank of colonel. Sheesh. The Lehmans had prior experience in, quote, taking the profits out of war, end quote, a double entendre, and one of Baruch's favorite phrases. In Men Who Rule America, I might have to get this book. I mean, that's such a straightforward title, right? In Men Who Rule America, Arthur D. Howard Smith writes of the Lehman Brothers during the Civil War, quote, they were often agents, fixers for both sides, intermediaries for confidential communications, and handlers of the many illicit transactions in cotton and drugs for the Confederacy, purveyors of information for the North. The Lehmans, with Mayor in Montgomery, the first capital of the Confederacy, and Henry in New Orleans and Emmanuel in New York, were ideally situated to take advantage of every opportunity for profit which appeared. They seem to have missed few chances. End quote. On the next page, we got chart 5. This one's kind of a big one, although it's still on one page. Now it's horizontal. This is chart 5, and it's a little bit blurry in some areas. I'm sorry about that. It's not the best photo in the world. But chart 5 subsection says, The David Rockefeller chart shows the link between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Standard Oil of Indiana, General Motors, and Allied Chemical Corporation, Eugene Mayer family, and Equitable Life, J.P. Morgan. So you have all these different companies under Chase Manhattan, and that's under David Rockefeller, chairman of the board, Chase Manhattan Corporation. All these companies connected. Now on to the main text of the chapter. Other appointments during the First World War were as follows. J.W. McIntosh, director of the Armor Meatpacking Trust, who was made chief of subsistence for the United States Army in 1918. He later became comptroller of the currency during Coolidge's administration and ex officio member of the Federal Reserve Board. During the Harding administration, he did his bit as director of finance for the United States Shipping Board when the board sold ships to the dollar lines for a hundredth of their cost and then let the dollar line default on its payments. After leaving public service, J.W. McIntosh became a partner of J.W. Woolman Company, Wollman Company, New York stockbrokers. W.P.G. Harding, governor of the Federal Reserve Board, was also managing director of the War Finance Corporation of the War Finance Corporation under Eugene Mayer. George R. James, member of the Federal Reserve Board in 1923 to 1924, had been chief of the cotton section of the War Industries Board. Henry P. Davison, Davison, senior partner in J.P. Morgan Company, was appointed head of the American Red Cross in 1917 in order to get control of the $370 million cash, which was collected from the American people in donations. Ronald Ransom, what a name, banker from Atlanta and governor of the Federal Reserve Board under Roosevelt in 1938 to 1939, had been the director in charge of personnel for foreign service for the American Red Cross in 1918. John Skelton Williams, comptroller of the currency, was appointed national treasurer of the American Red Cross. President Woodrow Wilson, the great liberal who signed the Federal Reserve Act and declared war against Germany, had an odd career for a man who is now enshrined as a defender of the common people. His chief supporter in both his campaigns for the presidency was Cleveland H. Dodge of Coon Loeb, who controlled National City Bank of New York. Dodge was also president of the Winchester Arms Company and Remington Arms Company. Isn't that a shotgun company? They make shotguns. I mean, Remington. Anyways, he was very close to President Wilson throughout the great Democrats' political career. Wilson lifted the embargo on shipment of arms to Mexico on January 12, 1914, so that Dodge could ship $1 million worth of arms and ammunition to Carranza, Carranza, Carranza. I can't really trill the R's. Double R's in Spanish is usually trilled. And promote the Mexican Revolution. Coon Loeb Company, which owned the Mexican National Railways system, had become dissatisfied with the administration of Huerta, Huerta. H is usually silent in Spanish, so Huerta, and had him kicked out. So we're on the next couple pages. So we got the next chart is chart 6. This one's subsection states this chart shows the interlocks between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, J. Henry Schroeder Trust Company, Rockefeller Center Incorporated, Equitable Life Assurance Society, J.P. Morgan in parentheses, and the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Yeah, that one's a little bit better to see than the other ones. Not as much going on there. You got all these companies. Back to the main text. When the British Naval Auxiliary Lusitania was sunk in 1915, it was loaded with ammunition from Dodge's factories. Dodge became chairman of the quote survivors of victims of the Lusitania Fund, quote unquote, which did so much to arouse the public against Germany. Dodge was also notorious for using professional gangsters against strikers in his plants. Yet the liberal Wilson does not appear to have ever been disturbed by this. Oh yeah, he's such a defender of the people, like it was claimed earlier. Um, where is it? I read it not too long ago. Dang, where'd it go? Oh well, I mean, yeah, so much for being a defender of the. And my headset conked out again. What's that, number 3? Yeah, so much for being the defender of the common people, jackass. Anyways, let's see what we got here. Another clue to Wilson's peculiar brand of liberalism is to be found in Chaplin's book, Wobbly, is the name of the book, Wobbly, which relates how Wilson scrawled the word refused, quote unquote, in all caps, across the appeal for clemency sent him by the aging and ailing Eugene Debs, who had been sent to Atlanta prison for, quote, speaking and writing against the war. How about that? Quote unquote. The charge on which Debs was convicted was, quote, spoken and written denunciation of war, quote unquote. This was treason to the Wilson dictatorship, and Debs was imprisoned. As head of the Socialist Party, Debs ran for the presidency from Atlanta prison. Lols. The only man ever to do so. As of this printing, sad trombone. Let's not go there. Back then, to have ever run a campaign for presidency while you're in prison, sheesh. Not why are we like? It's like we're reliving what was happening 100 years ago. Obviously, not exactly the same ways, but it's almost like I almost want to say it's like a morphic resonance of some sort. That's just that we're experiencing over and over again in history. Apparently, I don't know. It's like we're not repeating it, but it's certainly rhyming. Anyways, I'm gonna stop with that ramble. Where was I? Debs ran for the presidency from Atlanta prison, the only man ever to do so, and polled more than 8 million votes. It was ironic that Debs's leadership of the Socialist Party, which at that time represented the desires of many Americans for an honest government, should fall into the sickly hands of Norman Thomas, a former student and admirer of Woodrow Wilson at Princeton University. Under Thomas's leadership, the Socialist Party no longer stood for anything and suffered a steady decline in influence and prestige. Yeah, I wonder how much of that socialist movement is the same as today. I mean, I'm sure that's been subverted to hell, but also I don't think I would agree with that type of socialism back then either. So I'd have to do more research on that. But Debs running his presidential campaign from prison is kind of hilarious. Anyways, Wilson continued to be deeply involved in the Bolshevik Revolution, as were House and Weizmann. Volume 3, page 421 of House Intimate Papers records a cable from Sir William Weizmann to House from London, May 1st, 1918, suggesting Allied intervention at the invitation of the Bolsheviki, Bolsheviki, Bolsheviki. I guess that's plural, maybe in German. I mean German in Russian. To help organize the Bolshevik forces, Lieutenant Colonel Norman Thwaites, Thwaites, in his memoirs "Velvet and Vinegar" says, quote, "Often during the years 1917 to 1920, when delicate decisions had to be made, I consulted with Mr. Otto Kahn, whose calm judgment and almost uncanny foresight as to political and economic tendencies proved most helpful. Another remarkable man with whom I have been closely associated is Sir William Weizmann, who was advisor on American affairs to the British delegation at the Peace Conference, and liaison officer between the American and British government during the war. He was rather more than the Colonel House of this country in his relations with Downing Street." End quote. And now we move on to we move on to chart 7, which has a short subsection here stating, "This chart shows the interlocks of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York with Citibank, CITI, BANK, Citibank, not to be confused with First National Citibank or whatever that original bank was named. I don't know if it was renamed into Citibank that we now have today. But whatever, with Citibank, Guarantee Bank and Trust Company, JP Morgan Company, Morgan Guarantee Trust Company, Alex Brown and Sons, Brown Brothers Harriman, Kuhn Loeb Company, Los Angeles and Salt Lake RR, controlled by Kuhn Loeb Company, and Westinghouse, controlled by Kuhn Loeb Company. So all that's under the umbrella of Federal Reserve Directors, a study of corporate and banking influence, is the top part there. This is Kennecott Copper Officer, Director, and Interlocks. It's a lot of companies. Lots of companies. Anyways, Where was I? In the summer of 1917, Woodrow Wilson named Colonel House to head the American War Mission to the Inter-Allied War Conference, the first American mission to a European Council in history. House was criticized for naming his son-in-law, Gordon Auchincloss, Auchincloss, Gordon Auchincloss, Auchincloss, something like that, as his assistant on this mission. Paul Cravath, the lawyer for Kuhn Loeb Company, was third in charge of the American War Mission. Sir William Weissman guided the American War Mission in its conferences. In The Strangest Friendship in History, Viereck writes, quote, "After America entered the war, Weissman, according to Northcliffe, was the only man who had access at all times to the colonel and to the White House. Weissman rented an apartment in the house where the colonel lived. David Lawrence referred to the 53rd Street house, New York City, jestingly as the American number 10 Downing Street. Lols. Colonel House had a special code used only with Sir William Weissman. Colonel House was Bush, the Morgans were Haslam, and Trotsky was Keble." I'm not sure what that references to. That's going to be some kind of reference. End quote. Thus, these are two unofficial quote-unquote advisors to the British and American governments had a code solely for each other, which no one else could understand. Even stranger was the fact that the international communist espionage apparatus for many years used Colonel House's book, Philip Drew Administrator, as their official code book. Well, isn't that interesting? But here we're on to the next page, so we're on chart 8. Oh, a little bit of it's cut off, and we got to take the banner off. There we go. And it only cut off a couple more companies. I guess you kind of get the point anyway. This chart 8 subsection reads, "This chart shows the link between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Brown Brothers Harriman, Sun Life Assurance Company, parentheses, N.M. Rothschild and Sons, end parentheses, excuse me, and the Rockefeller Foundation." Sad trombone. Yep. Back to the text. After the armistice, Woodrow Wilson assembled the American delegation to the peace conference and embarked for Paris. It was on the whole a most congenial group, consisting of the bankers who had always guided Wilson's policies. He was accompanied by Bernard Baruch, Thomas W. Lamont of J.P. Morgan Company, Albert Strauss of J&W Seligman, bankers who had been chosen by Wilson to replace Paul Warburg on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, J.P. Morgan, and Morgan lawyers Frank Polk and John W. Davis. Accompanying them were Walter Lippmann, Felix Frankfurter, Justice Brandeis, and other interested parties. Mason's biography of Brandeis states that, quote, "In Paris in June of 1919, Brandeis met with such friends as Paul Warburg, Colonel House, Lord Balfour," interesting, Lord Balfour, Louis Marshall, and Baron Edmund de Rothschild, end quote. What do we got here? No citation for this quote. Interesting. Where did it start again? Huh. Where's the first quotation at? Okay, yeah. I guess Mason's biography of Brandeis. Whoever Mason is. I wish you had a proper citation there. Anyways, we're just moving on. Indeed, Baron Edmund de Rothschild served as the genial host to the leading members of the American delegation and even turned over his Paris mansion to them, although the lesser members had to rough it at the elegant Hotel Crillon, or Crillon, Crillon, with Colonel House and his personal staff of 201 servants. Baruch later testified before the Graham Committee of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, quote, I was economic advisor with the Peace Commission. Graham, did you freely advise with the president while there? Baruch, whenever he asked me advice, I gave it. I I had something to do with the reparations clauses. Ooh, hello. I had something to do with the reparations clauses. I was the American commissioner in charge of what they called the economic section. I was a member of the Supreme Economic Council in charge of raw materials. Graham, did you sit in the council with the gentlemen who were negotiating the treaty? Baruch, yes, sir, some of the time. Graham, all except the meetings that were participated in by the five the five being the leaders of the five allied nations end parentheses. Baruch, and frequently those also, end quote. And now we're on to the last chart, chart 9. Another big one. Its subsection reads, this chart shows the interlocks between the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and J.P. Morgan Company, Morgan Guaranty Trust Company, and the Rothschild affiliates of Royal Bank of Canada, Sun Life Assurance Company of Canada, Sun Life Alliance, and London Assurance Group. Some of that looks a little blurry. My apologies. Took a quick drink of water. Anyways, now we're continuing back with the main text here. I'll just leave this up for a little bit longer. Yeah. Paul Warburg accompanied Wilson on the American Commission to negotiate peace as his chief financial advisor. He was pleasantly surprised to find at the head of the German delegation his brother, Max Warburg, who brought along Karl Melchior, Melchior, also of M.M. Warburg Company, William George von Strauss, Franz Erbig, and Matthias Erzberger. Thomas W. Lamont states in his privately printed memoirs Across the World Frontiers, quote, the German delegation included two German bankers of the Warburg firm, whom I happened to know slightly, and with whom I was glad to talk informally, for they seemed to be striving earnestly to offer some reparations composition that might be acceptable to the Allies. End quote. Lamont was also pleased to see Sir William Wiseman, chief advisor to the British delegation. The bankers at the conference convinced Wilson that they needed an international government to facilitate their international monetary operations. Volume 4, page 52, Intimate Papers of Colonel House, quotes a message from Sir William Wiseman to Lord Reading, Reading, Lord Reading, August 16th, 1918, quote, the president has two main principles in view. There must be a League of Nations, and it must be virile, end quote. Sad trombone. Wilson, who seems to have lived in a world of fantasy, was shocked when American citizens booed him during his campaign to have them sign over their hard-won independence to what appeared to many to be an international dictatorship. He promptly went into a depression and retired to his bedroom. His wife immediately shut the White House doors against Colonel House, and from September 25th, 1919, to April 13th, 1920, she, let's turn the page here, ruled the United States with the aid of an intimate friend, her, quote, military aide, quote, end quote, Colonel Rixey Smith, Rixey. He was mentioned earlier in the book. As everyone was shut out of their deliberations, no one ever knew which of the pair functioned as the president, and which was the vice president. Pause for a cough. This is getting ridiculous. Even like, how is this? This is all staged. This is all freaking staged. You have Biden in office, and he was a freaking corpse. He was a zombie. He wasn't running shit. And now I learned that Wilson retired to his bedroom for like half a year, and no one knew if it was his wife or Colonel Smith that was running the show. Like the 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 similarities here is ridiculous. I mean, obviously not exactly the same, but how is this even happening? How is this even happening? Even this is crazy. How they're just taking from the old playbooks. I mean, it's not too crazy, I guess. They're just staging things over again with material that's from 100 years ago, and no one's we just don't study history enough to make the connections, I suppose. This is utterly ridiculous. Anyways, let's try to finish up this chapter before I get too distracted. Only got like a page left here. So they don't know if it was who was playing the role of president and who was vice president, because they were working behind closed doors. It seems to be everyone was shut out of their deliberations, so no one knew what was going on. Only those two, allegedly. So there's that. The admirers of Woodrow Wilson were led for decades by Bernard Baruch, who stated that Woodrow Wilson was the greatest man he ever knew. What a load of horseshit. Wilson's appointments to the Federal Reserve Board and that and that body's responsibility for financing the First World War, as well as Wilson's handing over of the United States to the immigrant triumvirate during the war, made him appear to be the most important single effector of ruin in American history. I don't know if he's the most important one, but he certainly ranks up there. I mean, freaking horrible, utterly unforgivable. It is no wonder that after his abortive trip to Europe, where he was hissed and jeered in the streets by the French people and snickered at in the halls of Versailles by Orlando and Clemenceau, Clemenceau, Woodrow Wilson returned home to take to his bed. The sight of the destruction and death in Europe, for which he was directly responsible, was perhaps more of a shock than he could bear. The Italian minister Pentaglioni, Pentaleoni, expressed the feelings of the European people when he wrote that, quote, Woodrow Wilson is a type of Pecksniff, capital Pecksniff, a type of Pecksniff who was now disappeared amid universal execration rather, end quote. It is America's misfortune that our subsidized press and educational system have been devoted to enshrining a man who colluded in causing so much death and sorrow throughout the world. Yeah. The financial cartels suffered only minor setbacks in those crucial years. On February 12, 1917, the New York Times reported that, quote, the 5 members of the Federal Reserve Board were impeached on the floor of the House by Representative Charles A. Lindbergh, Republican member of the House Banking and Currency Committee. According to Mr. Lindbergh, quote, the conspiracy against began in 1906. Why is there an apostrophe after in? That's weird. It must be a typo. Quote, the conspiracy began in 1906 when the late J.P. Morgan, Paul M. Warburg, a present member of the Federal Reserve Board, the National City Bank, and other banking firms conspired, quote unquote, to obtain currency legislation in the interest of big business and the appointment of a special board to administer such a law in order to create industrial slaves of the masses. To create industrial slaves of the masses. And the aforesaid conspirators did conspire and are now conspiring to have the Federal Reserve Board administered so as to enable the conspirators to coordinate all kinds of big business and to keep themselves in control of big business in order to amalgamate all the trusts into one great trust in restraint and in control of trade and commerce. End quote. The impeachment resolution was not acted on by the House. Of course it wasn't. The New York Times reported on August 10th, 1918, quote, Mr. Warburg's term having expired, he voluntarily retired from the Federal Reserve Board, end quote. Thus the previous intimation that Mr. Warburg left the Federal Reserve Board because he had a brother in the Secret Service of a foreign country, namely Germany, with whom we were at war, was not the cause of his retirement. Shock and horror. In any case, the utter ridiculous. In any case, He did not leave the Federal Reserve Administration. He immediately took over J.P. Morgan's seat on the Federal Advisory Council, from which post he continued to administer the Federal Reserve System for the next 10 years. And that is all we'll do for this part 5, because that was a good chunk. And we'll just end it there. That's just crazy stuff, man. They just keep making history repeat, if at least rhyme, if not repeat. So crazy, man. Like, I don't know. I'm just flabbergasted, I guess. So that'll be it for this one.